And now we'll be joined by Meri Williams for the final talk, our conclusive keynote for the day. So put your hand together again. Literally need to have applause for Meri.
Am I close enough to this? No. Let's do that instead. Hi, so I'm Meri. I'm geek_manager, not geek with no underscore. There's some poor bastard who has that account and gets all sorts of weird questions for the brief time that Twitter is still with us. By day, I'm a CTO. I have been CTO at Monzo, at Helix, which is AI-driven drug discovery, and I start a new job on Monday, but I'm not allowed to talk about it yet. But I'll be, if you follow me on Twitter, you'll find out where I am if Twitter's still running on Monday. But I started out as a hardware hacker, and I built part of South Africa's first satellite as a kid, which makes me have great parenting advice, which is don't let your kids do anything cool when they're young. I soldered something that went into space when I was 16, and it's all been fucking downhill since then, despite having done some seemingly cool things. I also advise for Kindred Capital. I'm on Stonewall's board, and I'm the chair of Lead Dev, which is a leadership conference disguised as a technology conference for those of you in the software world or who want to be in the software world. But I'm here today, a bit like our earlier speaker talking about intersecting identities, because I'm literally the one the Daily Mail warns you about. I'm a woman working in tech, which is unusual. I'm also a non-binary woman, which nobody understands. Oh, hang on, there we go, slides. I'm queer, I'm foreign, I'm employed, which I think is worse than if I were living off the state. But I kind of have to check the headlines regularly to be sure. I'm disabled, I'm neurodiverse, my career has ADHD, as you just saw, but so do I, and I'm also autistic. I'm godless, but I grew up white in apartheid South Africa, so I really understand and appreciate being having unasked, undeserved, unearned privilege. And that's been quite useful, because I think it helps me to bridge some gaps with people who are very, very privileged in that way. My whole childhood was full of signs like these. These are signs on toilets, on beaches saying whites only. And that's what it was like until 1994, which is really not that long ago. I can't deny that privilege. I got to go to university, I got to stay in school to the age of 18 because I was white, and I genuinely wouldn't have been allowed to do either of those things if I hadn't been. And so I think the most useful thing I can do is assess, understand, acknowledge that privilege, and then try and do something with it. If any of you haven't read The White Privilege Backpack from Peggy McIntosh, I highly recommend it. It's a genuinely useful thing for those of us who are white who just don't always realize how much the world is set up for us, how much we're taking for granted that is useful to us. I remember being in high school and there were kids who were sat next to me in class who their grades were worse in winter because they lived somewhere with no electricity and it's really hard to do your maths homework by candlelight. And I can promise you, none of the rest of us were switching on the lights in the evening to do our fucking maths homework going, oh, I'm so glad I have the privilege of this electricity and this warmth, right? Privilege is the thing you don't realize, you don't appreciate is giving you an advantage a lot of the time. And the tech industry has this unfortunate myth of meritocracy that we believe that nobody knows you're a cat on the internet, but they usually aren't assuming that you're a queer or a person of color either. Let's be honest. And I think we need to change how we think about and talk about equality. A lot of people talk about equality as treating everybody the same. And true equality is treating people differently to achieve equality of outcomes, equality of opportunity, rather than pretending that, the person who's already tall enough to see over that fence doesn't need a box to stand on. It helps them in a way that is not fair, fundamentally. And so not discriminating is important, like legally, if nothing else. But we all know that the legal threshold is not even being met most of the time. But I think that too often we're aiming for tolerance, And tolerance is a kind of a shitty word. My little brother kind of hates me, but he tolerates me because we're family. It means he puts up with me. I don't want to be tolerated in my work environment. I don't want people putting up with me despite the fact I am who I am. I want them to see those differences as superpowers rather than as kind of things to make an allowance for. And so I think we should be aiming for fully inclusive environments instead. And so if diversity is a spectrum where we've got the kind of active hatred and isms that were talked about earlier on one side, full inclusions over here, but indifference and tolerance and, you know, the reality of microaggressions that many of us experience is somewhere down the middle. I'm not sure if everybody knows the definition of a microaggression. I missed the morning, so somebody already covered this in loads of detail. Apologies. I like this particular example, though, that, you know, we tell young girls that they're very pretty and we tell young boys they're very smart or very strong, and it's one of the small ways that we program people to be lesser all the way through their lives. But why do we even care about this? And I know I'm preaching to the choir because it's a room full of folks who are different, but if you need any evidence to convince other people or to believe in yourself when you're going out looking for a role and trusting that you've got more to offer than other people might realize, there is so much evidence that diverse teams win. You're going to be 35% more likely to have outperform your competitors if you've got a healthy ethnic balance, 15% more likely if you have a healthy balance of gender. There's more chance of greater innovation and significant patents. Like I say, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, so I'll just flick through these very rapidly. But there is so much evidence that if we just put different kinds of people together and then work really well with them, that we will get to better outcomes. And not only do diverse teams win, but homogeneous teams suck and they lose. And so I've hit the point now where I don't even care about companies that don't want to be good at this shit, because they're just gonna die. Like, we have a very live example of this happening right now at Twitter, right? He's gone, I don't want any of you snowflake engineers who only want to work your like regular hours, and the rest of you, if anybody doesn't want to sign up to like hardcore Twitter too, you could all leave. And he said that yesterday and expected lots of people to stay, and very, very few people are staying. I'm very sad about Twitter, but it's not going to stay up very long because you just can't run a decent team with those few people and those few people who are all exactly the same as each other. Because folks who are staying, except those on visas who are sadly in a very difficult position, they are very undiverse, the majority of them, and they are not going to win. But it's really difficult to be really inclusive. There's quite a lot of evidence that if you just focus on diversity, you just put lots of different people together, but you don't work on making it actually an inclusive environment, it can make things worse rather than better. Many of us will have experienced or will experience being like the token different one, and it's really difficult. Just adding us doesn't make it better. Adding us and making it possible for us to succeed is what makes it better. And again, I'm just linking to a bunch of research because we like research. We're scientists. But people perform better when they can be themselves. Stonewall did research it's about 20 years ago now, but it still holds true that people could be up to 40% more productive if they could be themselves at work. And I think that is firstly a no-brainer. If you could get 2 extra days of productivity out of someone, that's an amazing thing that if you just make the environment better, then why wouldn't you do that? But also worth remembering for all of us that that's how heavy the tax is when we have to pretend to be something that we're not. You can lose the equivalent of 2 days a week of productivity of work, and I know it's a very capitalist way of viewing the world, but like, run with me here. It's a way that you convince companies to do better at this shit. So how do we move the right way? This is the end of the depressing part, I promise. So we stop allowing underprivileged groups, and like ourselves, to be pushed away, and we start building actively inclusive environments, which is kind of suspicious because it's a little bit too pat, too easy to say, right? And so in terms of crafting inclusive environments, I've done a lot of work over the years with lots of different companies, mostly companies, but a few non-corporate organizations as well, about how to craft these better, more inclusive environments. And I think it comes down to these three questions that we're asking ourselves, either consciously or subconsciously. We're always asking, am I expected here? Is someone like me even expected to work at this place? Am I respected here? Am I going to be viewed, are my differences going to be viewed as a feature or a bug? And then can I be myself and be successful here? If I am here, do I have to spend a lot of my energy and my time pretending to be something that I'm not? And so to go into a little bit more detail about this, this is about looking at, am I expected here is about looking at company websites. I'm really sorry to the interpreters, I talk really quickly because I'm South African. They had to switch over, which makes me worried that I'm going far too fast. I'll try and switch, slow down. So am I expected here is looking at the external indications. How many companies do you see that it's just all white 23-year-old dude bros? The startups in London who come to me are like, we just don't understand why nobody wants to work here who isn't like white 23 and straight and a dude. And I'm like, you literally have the only thing on your benefits page is beer pong and like cocktail Fridays. Is it really that big a surprise? Sorry, I'm keeping track. So think about that from all of these different points of view, from protected characteristics, which in the UK is a nice long list, and the US is missing some things, but also adds some things. Think beyond those legal requirements. Think about neurodiversity, education level, mother tongue, social class, all of these other aspects that are also really important. And then, sorry, I have somehow lost myself. There we go. And remember that role modeling matters. I used to think that role modeling didn't matter, and that's partly because I studied computer science, which is like 94% dudes, and getting worse year by year, which is really shitty, but sadly the case. But when I was in charge of recruitment for a while at one of the companies I worked for, every time we took a woman to the presentations, we got 100% more applications from women students. And it made me realize just how important role modeling was. If you can't be it, if you can't see it, you can't be it, is a genuinely true thing. But it'll mean that wherever you join, they're going to want you to go out and be that role model. So make sure that you hold them to account and get them to actually be a good place to be before you're willing to be shopped out and held up in front of people for that reason. And remember that role modeling kind of works in two ways. I used to run the summer internship program at P&G, and every summer we'd have kind of a role modeling session in the middle of the summer internships, and some brave intern would be like, did you always know you were going to be this senior? And they'd be asking like a director or VP, someone really, really senior at the company. And the men all said, yeah, I believed in myself, I backed myself every step of the way, and I got there. And the women literally all said, no, I never thought I'd get here. And sometimes I said no to promotions and to jobs until my mentors told me that they knew I was ready. And it made me fundamentally different as a manager. I went back to work having had this realization and had a really in-depth conversation with someone about why I believed in them. They were like the star of the department kind of thing. We'd had a discussion in our lead team about how it's a little ridiculous that we had an award for them pretty much every all hands that we had. And they burst into tears. And I was like, oh, fuck, screwed this up. And they had never actually been told what they were doing right in detail. They'd gotten plenty of like attaboys, plenty of like thumbs up, but they hadn't ever been told concretely what they were doing right, and they had the worst case of imposter syndrome that I've ever seen, despite being the top performer in the entire department and probably in the entire country at the time. And it made me really aware that when you mentor people, when you are dealing with people who are maybe at a different point in their career than you are, it's really important to tell them that you believe in them and why you believe in them. Sorry. And then if any of you are in the in the position now or in future, make sure to audit your job specs and make sure that the language that's used is mixed and fair. There's a number of different tools that you can use to get better at this. There's a gender decoder that Kat Matfield has made, freely available. If you've got budget, there's things like Textio. But you can do a lot to make your job specs actually reflect what is hopefully the reality at the organization, that it can appeal to a wide range of people. But some of this is all just about trust, right? I'm not sure I'm getting in that plane with that cat. And so it's important to think about this question of, am I expected here? But you can make that better at an organization and it not actually be better on the inside. So it's important to almost view these questions, to work on these questions in reverse order. In terms of, am I respected here? You know, do you feel respected and valued when you interact with an organization? Do pay attention to those little niggles when you are assumed to be there for a different job because they assume things based on your gender or your identity or how you look on the day. Think about how recruiters interact with you, how interviewers interact with you. Pay attention to what's happening around you when you're going in for interview somewhere or when you're being the interviewer. Educate yourself and others about privilege and implicit bias. There's a load of great material on this that, weirdly, Facebook put out into the world, which I'm not sure they're the best at this, but the materials are actually pretty good and freely available. But the original stuff from Harvard is available online as well. And I'm pretty sure that I'm in a room full of people who understand what privilege means, but if you need to explain it to people who don't get it yet, I found this from John Scalzi is quite a good articulation. He talks about being a straight white male as being the lowest difficulty setting in the game of life. It's not that your life isn't hard, it's a hell of a lot easier than it is for everybody else. And same for, you know, all of us are a mix of different characteristics and identities, and in some we're privileged and in some we're under-indexed or underprivileged, right? And that's just about implicit bias. And then again, I know I'm talking to, this is a career-focused day, so maybe it's more advice for the people who will be interviewing you than for you yourselves, but it's useful to train people to be better interviewers as well, and to spot that kind of bias. If you're being interviewed and it isn't focused on your past experiences, it's more likely to be a biased interview. If people are making assumptions about your experience rather than letting you speak for yourself, then it's worth trying to get in and give those specific examples rather than leaning too far into hypotheticals. You can even affect this by, if somebody asks you a hypothetical question, if you have a concrete answer for it, like give the concrete example from the past rather than answering the hypothetical question. It's a much better way to approach things. And then something that I do a lot in organizations I work in is train interviewers and the people who run the debriefs to be actively on the lookout for that kind of biased language and biased terminology and similar, so that we are trying to spot it when we're debriefing and address it rather than let that bias continue through the process. It's also worth assessing your communication that you do around interview from different perspectives. I have something called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. All my joints dislocate. So some days I can stand and walk, and some days I'm on crutches, and some days I'm in a wheelchair. And I have never interviewed anywhere where I could proactively figure out whether I'd be able to get into an interview room on crutches or in a wheelchair. And I'm a lot of decades into my career now, more than I want to admit. And it's pretty horrendous that that's been the case. And I'm lucky. I'm only sometimes in a wheelchair or on crutches. I'm not permanently affected, right? And so very few companies are good at sharing access information ahead of time. Very few conferences will tell you whether you'll be able to get around without steps and those kind of things. How do you make it clear that someone with dyslexia or similar can get extra time in the interview process? How do you make appropriate accommodations for folks. I've had somebody come to me and say, I'm worried I didn't perform well in this set of back-to-back interviews because it's the middle of Ramadan and I'm fasting. And I was like, oh, how did we not realize that we needed to spread this out over more days, or at least ask the question better about how to better accommodate? And then finally, this question of can I be myself and be successful here is about, how much energy you're going to have to expand to pretend to be something that you're not. And I think the more ways your identities intersect, the more likely it is that you're spending this energy. I sound British these days. I've adopted my wife's very middle-class accent. It does me quite well. But people who don't realize that I'm South African think of me as a very, very rude Brit. I'm a very polite South African, but the directness level is quite different between our cultures, right? And so I do find myself having to hide some of that to fit in a very British environment. When I work in companies that have got a much wider range of nationalities, I feel much more at home because people are much more used to the idea that maybe someone's just being different, they're not trying to be an asshole. They're just a bit more direct or a bit less direct. And fundamentally, I think we're all trying to get to the point that we feel like we have the opportunity to do what we do best every day. And this is actually one of the 12 questions that predicts high-performing teams. If you can have a significant portion of your team saying that they get to do what they do best, not only what they do best, but what they do best every day, you're much more likely to have a high-performing team. And we need to let people have those spikes of brilliance, to stop leveling people out to consistent mediocrity, and instead focus on getting the most out of difference. We're not interchangeable resource units. And if somebody calls you a resource, call them overhead until they stop. Because it's always people who are overhead who call other people resources. We're colors or flavors. We're better in complement or in concert with each other, right? I would watch the hell out of a Seven Hulks movie, but the reality of the Avengers is they're cool is because they're good at very different things, right? And by our powers combined, we can be better than otherwise. And so think of it less as trying to get lots of interchangeable resources and more of a matter of people and roles as a matter of casting. How do we put the person in a role that is going to best show off their strengths? How do you assemble that team that has complementary abilities? I got very upset at man-children on the internet hating on the Ghostbusters movie when it came out. I saw it 11 times in the cinema. I took 100 people with me. There is still some poor data scientists in the center of the Odeon who still can't work out why Ghostbusters ran for 16 weeks at Leicester Square. But turns out if you fill the cinema once a week, it runs for an extra week. But another team that's really cool because they've got different capabilities. Also, if you rewatch this movie believing that the Chris Hemsworth character is Thor's Clark Kent personality, it makes it even better. Highly recommend. Other things you can do, you can check if systems are loaded. If you have to pitch for a pay rise, you end up worsening the gender pay gap. And shy guys or folks who are from less individualistic cultures, they suffer as well. And so you can make it better for everybody by reducing that kind of pitch for a pay rise approach. Train managers to spot biased feedback, and I know it's difficult as an individual to highlight when you're being given biased feedback, but it's worth trying to start those conversations and save up the links and the examples and push back sometimes on feedback that you get as well. He's an interesting artist. He does a lot of collaboration with Zulu artists in South Africa. But this is a song about being forced to pretend to be something that you're not, being forced to adopt the colonizers' approaches to things. And there's a lot of advice out there that reads a lot like be more like a, straight, loud, cis American white guy, right? A lot of self-help books would have you just try to be something that you're not, and people will never react to you the way that they would to that person. That's one of the unfortunate realities of this, is like you can pretend all you want, but they're still going to punish us for being who we are. And so rather than having a kind of like, oh no, run away, or my wife would tell you that this swan is my patron saint. I used to be a bouncer. I like don't have a flight reaction. I just square up into everything. Much to her distress on occasion. She's very middle class and English and quiet. But you know, you're gonna get shitty feedback. You're gonna get people discriminating against you. How you react to it is the part that's fully within your grasp. And you can help educate folks around you and your manager to do better at that. Wherever possible, value the what over the how. Let people achieve things in their own way. And remember that when you're mentoring other people as well, they need to be pretty similar to you to be able to take your advice and to do things the way that you would do it. Bear that in mind when you get advice too. If you get advice from someone who's markedly different from you, like in a number of different identities, the reaction they would get to acting that way is, or saying those things, is going to be different to the way that people react to you. So don't just take that advice and run with it. Try and figure out what they're trying to achieve and how you can achieve the same thing. And frame guidance altruistically. We used to run a kind of networking training as part of this internship program that I ran. And the guy who used to do it was this very salesy guy who was like, talk to everybody, man. You never know who could be useful to you. And it didn't go down great with everybody, as you'd imagine. And the time we changed it to a kind of bake more pie approach of talk to everybody, you never know who you could help, fundamentally changed how successful people were at networking, but also at the actual internship, because a lot depended on you being able to find people who knew things and being able to build those relationships. So you needed to build them for a reason that you were kind of comfortable within yourself. And then the other thing to remember is that we as under-indexed folks, we are wildly over-mentored and under-sponsored. Mentoring is when somebody gives you advice to your face. Sponsoring is when they're in the background, when you're not there, helping you by getting you opportunities, by getting you onto that important project, by helping you to open doors and unlock opportunities. And so for yourselves, if you're in the position, just like know sometimes you need sponsors as well as mentors. But also when you are in a position of power, whether it's now or one day in the future, remember that you can sponsor someone very effectively without them ever even knowing, just by making sure that people are aware that they're a good choice for different opportunities. And so when we're thinking about, can you be yourself and be successful, think about whether there are role models, how much you have to change yourself to succeed. Are there multiple visible routes to success? I'll be honest, like I said at the beginning, I'm the one the Daily Mail warned you about. I haven't had many direct, actual role models who are all of the things that I am, but I find a small part of myself represented in some ways in some organizations. I've also worked places where it genuinely looked like the leadership were probably wearing matching underwear to go with their matching ties and haircuts, right? And one of the places that I worked at that was like that, they were doing what are you gonna do for the first time ever? And the first guy was like, make a meal for my family. He was in his 50s, and he was going to make a meal for his family as his big thing he was going to do for the first time ever. And then the second person said, do the laundry. And the whole room made a noise like that, right? And then I happened to be sat next to the poor woman who ran diversity and inclusion at this place, and I leaned over and I went, so Tina, what I'm getting from this is, it's a really good thing that I have a wife already, but she needs to stop with this designing hospitals bullshit. My wife's an architect. And go home and like do the laundry and make all the meals for me, right? That's how I get onto that stage. And she was just sat with her head in her hands. They stopped asking at that point. They realized from the like, noise in the room that they had made a mistake. But also remember that like every role is capable of virtuosity. There are roles that you would hate to have that somebody else can be really brilliant at. I genuinely believe very few people wake up in the morning thinking, today I'm aiming for just south of mediocre, and if I can fuck up everybody else's day along the way, my day will be perfect, right? Arseholes exist in the world, see Twitter, but I think mostly people want to be good at what they do, and they want to get up in the morning and be excited about their job. And so, give people the chance to do that. I'm a little low on time, so I'm not going to run through the recap, but I will post the slides on the social media network that may disappear instantaneously in the near future. But if you take one thing away from this today, remember that you're probably asking yourself these questions, and they are good questions to ask. Try figure out if you're expected, if you're going to be respected, and if you can be yourselves and be successful. And if the place that you're at now doesn't let you answer yes to multiple of these questions, you can choose to stay and make it better, or you can choose to find somewhere better. And the good news is that increasingly there are better places available. There are better places to work. There are many, many more organizations that are focusing on inclusion and equity than ever used to. And so hopefully things are getting better out there in the world. And then a final thought, that though many of us are under-indexed, we're in the minority, we can also be allies to others. The most effective that the LGBT network that I started at P&G ever was when we were really closely connected with the other networks. And we were the ones going, hey, there's no fucking prayer room, and that's not cool, just as often as the Black Employees Network was highlighting that we didn't have equal rights, and speaking for each other, trying to be not speaking instead of each other, but uplifting each other's messages can be really powerful. And then Duredi Herpa has this great phrase where she says, we shouldn't just try to be allies, we should try to be accomplices. Try to be the one that will help the person bury the body as well as everything else. Thank you very much. That's it from me. This is the hedgehog of Wynn. So, yeah.
That's fantastic.
Any questions?
Yeah. Any question for Meri? I can start with one. Mm-hmm. What would you say are clear red flags when, for example, you're looking for a job, looking at a company website or social media presence, or during an interview?
So I think looking at a website is just seeing no evidence that anybody different is expected. If everybody looks the same, if the benefits page is literally things like foosball and beer Wednesdays, like those are places that have not yet reached enlightenment, and I would avoid them. In person, it tends to be more subtle. It's microaggressions. It's a lot of women software engineers, they'll arrive for the interview and somebody will go, oh, you're here for the design position. And there's nothing wrong with being a designer, but that happening over and over again is just so tiring when you're an engineer, right? And so I think a lot of the in-person things tend to be smaller things, but they're worth keeping an eye out for. There's obviously also sometimes outright sexism or homophobia or whatever, and those are very easy to see, but it's the smaller things that are worth kind of trying to tune into to be aware of, because it's a lot harder once you're in a company to then have to leave after a short time than to figure that out at the outset.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Oh, yeah. 1 second.
Thank you very much for the speech. Really enjoyed it. Have you got any advice for trying to reach people who are more set in their ways with these kind of with messages like this about D&I and things like that?
So mostly take the evidence, because there's so much of it now, like all those slides I had at the beginning of how teams are more innovative, more high-performing and everything else, because it's not great, but in the capitalist system that we're in, like showing people that it's going to lead to greater business success tends to be the way that you can win that argument and get people to pay attention to it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any more questions?
Just in a situation where like the interview is great and you met like it was very, they let you talk to people who are like diverse, and when you actually go to the workplace, when you accept the offer, it's terrible, and after like some time you decide to leave. Is there any measures that you can do to make this institute aware of what they are doing and to leave at least something or like an impact before leaving, to tell them you are doing this bad and maybe you are not noticing it, be careful?
Yeah, so sometimes some places will do an exit interview, and being honest in an exit interview is a little risky, but it can help. The other thing I would do in that situation, though, is if you had a good interview experience, is go find the people who were part of that good interview experience that were diverse, that gave you the impression it was good, because maybe they want to make it better. And maybe they're the people who are most likely to hear what you say when you're like, this seemed good from the outside, but when I've actually been here, it's been terrible. So I would go try find those allies and accomplices and talk with them directly, because sometimes the kind of exit interview approach, it can just be, you know, pushed under the carpet rather than really heard, unfortunately. I would advise against writing like open letters to the CEO, which I've seen a couple of people do, but it tends to go over very badly unless you have if you have the relationship with somebody very senior to tell them, then tell them much more directly. Don't do it in a kind of, in that kind of public way. It tends to, criticism given very publicly tends to not be listened to as much, unfortunately. Even though I think we should speak truth to power, unfortunately, it tends to get diluted rather than listened to. Sure.
Yeah, maybe kind of to comment also like of what Omar was saying. I think there is maybe a difference between like private companies and universities. Yes. And I think on this sense, I think like private company is a bit better the situation, because you have this level of managers, so you can complain to your line manager or the one just above your line manager if the problem is with your manager. And this system, I think in big organization actually works well, and you can kind of make it. I think universities in this sense of it's much more difficult, because it's like PIs, they have like a position, like bulletproof position, they would not be removed by anything almost. Especially I think if you are a postdoc, that's the worst case, because if you are a student, you have some kind of rights and PIs will be like very careful of what students say. But like when you are in a middle position like postdocs, that's like the worst, because you don't have any right and you have to do the job, otherwise you will not go to the next position, you need good recommendations. So it's, yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it's hard for that
That's
position.
very fair. Most of my experiences, almost all my experience has been private sector, so very much agree that listen to other people on academic environments.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask if you have any advice, because I am literally the most junior person in my workplace, and like, there's a sort of culture that like, at first everyone's like, oh, we all did our diversity training, it's fine, but then the culture creeps in little by little. But like, there's no like incident I can point at and be like, that was really bad, because it's just sort of a creeping culture. But everyone above me who I could possibly talk to is a straight, white, cis man. And so I was just wondering if you have any advice for like someone in my position as to like, what do you do then?
So I think like, they're not all the same, so try find the one who you think could be converted into an ally. And like, weirdly, that's often the one who like, they've got daughters, which we all know that they should have cared before they had daughters, but if that's the only reason they fucking care, then sometimes it's reasonable to go to them. But like, I would try to figure out if there's any of them who aspire to be better, and then try and kind of pair up with them and give examples of the positive culture you would like to see. Because you're right, sometimes it's all just a feeling and it's hard to put your finger on exactly what's wrong, but maybe you could articulate what could be right in a much better way, and then try try taking a couple of those suggestions to some of those people and see how they react, because possibly one of them is more willing and more likely to be an accomplice or an ally than you realize at the moment. That's the main advice I've got.
All right, we come to the end of the conference. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. There's going to be some more refreshment, and you have an opportunity to network. But I have to ask you to move very quickly out of this room, because they're going to rearrange it for the next event. If you can put your hands together again for Meri, that close our session. Thank you all.
And again, for Alfredo and the team for putting everything together today.